Hello, swing dancers. It's Julien for Blablaswing, and today it's not a usual day because we are in presence of amazing man called Lennart. Hello, Lennart. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon. First of all, we are sitting in Herrang. It's the 31st of July. We are in the middle of the Herrang Dance Camp, and I guess the reason that we are sitting here is because I've spent a lot of time over the last soon 40 years around the Lindy Hop. So we'll see what comes out of this little discussion that we're going to have.
Yeah, and I confess it makes me a little nervous because for Blablaswing it's like an achievement to discuss with you. So 40 years of collecting information, dancing, bringing the jazz and the swing dance in Europe, it's a huge heritage. And how do you met the love of jazz and dance? How it happened for you?
Well, before I answer that question, I would like to say that it was not me as a person making this happen in Europe. It was a handful of people back in the days. But it's not very many of them today that are still in the scene. But I was probably one of the most active trying to do something. We didn't know exactly what we wanted to do. Some of us were teaching a little bit, but some of us were more trying to learn and to maybe perform with the dance or something. Because there was no full social context at the time, because we were very few and kind of spread out. So I was one of those. So that's short words for my background. But to answer your question also, I don't know exactly. When I grew up, I lived in a town where there was very little dancing going on. But for some reason I started to take some dance classes, more in Swedish folk dancing and foxtrot maybe, things like that. And I kind of liked it. I didn't know what I should do with it, but I kind of liked it. But a few years later I moved to Stockholm. And then the opportunities opened up for trying to learn some different kind of dances, and one of those dances that I started with was something that was called jitterbug, and it was danced to 50s music. It was Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And for some reason I just liked the music, and I also liked the kind of dancing we learned. It was a 6-count dance starting with a toe heel back rock, gradually triple step back rock, and it was a lot of young people doing it. It was a very inspiring environment, and we competed a lot. It was a lot of air steps into it, so it was a quite physical kind of dancing, and at that time I was a few years over 20, and I thought it was very exciting, the whole thing. So I stepped into it on a hobby level, but I was still on the enthusiastic side around things. And at that time I didn't know anything about the background of the dance. We thought, if we thought anything, we were thinking of this dance as an American dance from the 50s. And we didn't know anything about swing music, about Harlem, about the African American roots of the dance. That was unknown to us. And I'm not even sure if our teachers knew anything. It had been forgotten, that part of the history. It kind of existed in another kind of environment. And that environment was not knowledgeable on all the roots that actually the dance had.
Yeah. And if we read the book of Rocky Manning, we understand that there is almost 50 years of nothing. He just working like he is still continuing to dance, if I'm correct, and he was a postmaker. And at this point, there is some stories about you and a few people who discover all the videos and try to make them come in Europe, in Sweden. Is that correct?
First of all, one thing is the dance never disappeared fully, even though let's say there was a lack of interest gradually over the years in the dance. 40s, 50s, the dance was probably still in reasonably good condition, but in the 60s and 70s, very few people did this dance. Some of the old-timers kept it alive in New York, so it was never died out completely, but it was on a much lower level than before. And of course, young people didn't step into the dance at the time. It was... and ballrooms didn't exist the same way as they had before. Couple dancing was not in demand, really. And I think it's also correct to say that over the years, maybe more and more white people had stepped into this dance, and gradually black people at the time, I think they were more progressive. They wanted to do new things. So they moved into other forms of dancing and music, while white people were sometimes holding on to it maybe a little bit longer. But in the 60s, it was a very progressive time in America. So I think at that time, I think it was extremely hard to collect new black dancers into the dance, because the whole political revolution around black people's situation in America was very, what could be the word in English? It was very strong movements for the rights of black people, and some of these people that were on the activist side, I don't think they wanted to look back too much into the history of all those things. They wanted to move forward. They knew the history, but I don't think they appreciated what had been 20, 30, 40, 50 years before. So that part of the dance culture kind of was suppressed at the time, and people didn't have any black people didn't have any strong will to really pick up on the tradition of traditional jazz dancing, because it belonged to a period that they didn't appreciate so much. But anyway, it always existed, and somewhere, now we are talking about the late 70s, there was a little bit of a boom in New York for big band music, and people danced. If they called it the Lindy or the Jitterbug or sometimes the Lindy Hop, I can't say fully. But big bands kind of came back in New York in the late 70s. And a lot, especially white people, stepped into it. And they did some kind of white downtown Manhattan version based on 6 counts. And that was the dancing that was probably called swing dancing at the time. And very few, maybe none of the elderly Savoy dancers came to these dances, because they probably danced more in bars, nightclubs, private parties and so on. So there was a white kind of revival in New York for this music in the late 70s already. But then in the early 80s, there was a new situation when Albert Mintz came out of some kind of dance retirement, starting to teach at Sandra Cameron Dance Center. So that was kind of the beginning of holding on to the roots in a much better way, and also the beginning of teaching the Lindy Hop. And when I say Lindy Hop, I mean the Harlem version of swing dancing.
Yeah, okay.
So that was kind of the beginning of it all. And some of us, a few years later, we came across this little part of the history that had happened in the late 70s and into the early 80s. So we had the opportunity then to meet some of these people that were still in circulation, and especially Albert Mintz, since at the time he was the only one teaching the dance. There was no one else that really was on the teaching floor as far as the old-timers were concerned. So it was a very inspiring environment to come into, and very exciting. It was like you were looking for something. You didn't know exactly what you were looking for, but you knew something from books, something from films, but you had no idea what was left of it. And that was the thing some of us faced in the early 80s when we came to New York looking for this. So that was the beginning for me, and I never knew at the time that it would lead to a complete change of direction in my life, because it was still a hobby, even though there was a little bit of obsession already.
Yeah, a huge obsession. Yeah.
Yeah, and after meeting Albert Mintz especially, it opened up for the whole spectrum of African American culture back in the days. And I've always been interested in history, so for me it was very interesting to hear everything that had any kind of connection to the time period when the Lindy Hop was big.
Yeah.
So that was for me important, and I started to read books that could give me a little bit more of a different angles on the time era, and especially what happened in Harlem at the time.
So before before you start the first Herrang Dance Camp in Sweden, you go first to New York? No?
Herrang Dance Camp started before we knew anything about the African American background of this dance.
Okay.
Herrang started in 82, and at that time we didn't know that part of the story. So the only intention we had at the time was to find an American instructor. We knew that the dance came from America, but we didn't know much more. So we found a man, and he had been working for many years at the dance studio in New York. And how we found him, I don't remember. It wasn't me doing that job. But he was found. He said he could teach the Lindy. We were dancing the jitterbug. We didn't know what the Lindy was, but he told us it's kind of the same thing. So we made an agreement with him to come here. And he gave us kind of the first foundation of this dance. But it was from a downtown Manhattan white middle class perspective. And as I said, he came out of a dance school environment. He was not a street dancer like the originators of the dance were. So he came out of another segment of American society. But he gave us some tools that we had never seen before, like 8 counts, Lindy circles. So he knew more than we did for sure. And he had some kind of American tradition for the dance. But he had never been to the Savoy, because we spoke about those things, because we had heard about the Savoy ballroom without knowing what it was really. But he said he had never been there. But still, I don't have any memory that he ever fully told us the story about the importance of black people for the creation of this dance. Maybe he told something, but I never understood it fully. So it took a little bit more time, and I would say we were probably into 1983, the year after Herrang started, when we found Marshall Stern's book, Jazz Dance, and that book kind of opened up the perspective for us.
You find it in Sweden? Or?
Yeah, it was at the Dance Museum in Stockholm. So a friend of mine found it, and he showed it to me, and the two of us became very enthusiastic when we read this, because then we understood that there must be an enormous potential, or there had been an enormous potential around the dance that we never had understood before. It was very exciting. The text, the pictures that were in, we understood that this is something we need to look into.
It's still difficult nowadays to find this book. There is only few copies on eBay, and sometimes not quite good quality.
Yeah, it hasn't been printed for many years, I guess now. But it's, I think at the time at least, this was the only book that you could read and say, aha, now I understand a little bit of the background. I don't think there were any alternative books on the same level as Jazz Dance was. So for us it was very important. That book opened up a kind of perspective. We didn't know what it was really, but it led to that we saw Day at the Races and Helsa Poppin. And the combination of the book, watching those movies in the movie theaters in Stockholm, led to that we decided to go to New York to see what there was left. And this was in May 1984.
Oh, only 2 years after starting.
Yeah, so Herrang started in 82 with a more Lindy jitterbuggish approach, but this was the Lindy Hop, the Harlem dance, and that was something totally different from what we had done before, and a totally different cultural context. And we got very excited to use a mild expression.
Oh yeah. And can you tell me what is the difference for you between Lindy Hop and jitterbug?
I don't know. People have so different opinions on those things. So I wouldn't be able to say. I think it depends who uses the word, in which part of the world the word is used. I think it's an impossibility to really define it. But when I think from reading history books, and some people have pointed it out, very often if you spoke about the entire US at the time, if people spoke about the Lindy Hop, it seemed like many people were thinking of New York directly. The Lindy Hop was somehow New York. But if you were in New York at the time, if people spoke about the Lindy Hop, it often meant the kind of dances that were done in Harlem at the time. So for New Yorkers, the Lindy Hop was probably a name that had a reference to Harlem more than anywhere else. But if you said the Lindy, that was a wider perspective that included more of New York, also the white people's way of possibly dancing the dance, which might have been both different and similar to how black people did the dance.
Yeah,
but
sense.
Jitterbug, I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, it was probably a word that meant something else than the dance from the beginning, more referring to a person that might not be the best of dancers. He or she is a jittering bug, a jitterbug. So it might not have been the best word for the dance, but it's very tricky to say.
Yeah, and let's go back to New York. What happened there? You met Albert Mintz maybe, and things going on?
We came there, and in May '84 we started to call people. We had some names with reference to Marshall Stern's jazz dance. We didn't find the people we were looking for. We started to call dance schools instead, and we came to Sandra Cameron Dance Center. And when we called them, they said, we have a teacher here, his name is Albert Mintz, and he teaches the Lindy Hop. And we had read about Albert Mintz in jazz dance. So we understood it must be the man that is in the book here. So we asked, when can we see him? And we were given some advice. So a few days later, we met up with Al at the big memorial dance concert for Count Basie that had passed a few months before. So Al was there dancing together with many other old-timers that had a background in Harlem and at the Savoy Ballroom. But at that time, we only knew about Al. So we were on the lookout for him. Mm-hmm. And then someone pointed him out, and we introduced ourselves. And then we were trying to hang out with him as much as we could for those 3 weeks that we were in New York, because he became our source for information.
And after that, you asked him to come to teach in Herrang?
No, we asked him to come to Stockholm.
Yes.
So he came in October. He came in late September '84, and he stayed for about a month in Stockholm. And he was working at inside the little society that we had, which was called Swedish Swing Society. So he worked with the members of that society and some external people that showed up for the weekends. So he was busy. I think he was teaching more or less every day.
Wow. And this is a first step to spread the Lindy Hop in...
Yeah, we wanted, of course, all dancers in Sweden to convert from the Swedish jitterbug that we had done for maybe 5-6 years at the time. Mm-hmm. We wanted them to leave that and move over to swing music instead of rock and roll music, and try to learn how to dance the Lindy Hop instead. It wasn't that easy. There were a small minority that actually picked up on the ideas of Al. Most people, they took just a few steps, and they implemented it with what they already were doing. And that was not a good solution from our point of view. So 6 of us gradually decided we can't stay hanging around with these other people that don't understand anything. So we decided to kind of step away from Swedish Swing Society, forming a little performance troupe that we called the Rhythm Hotshots. And that group became the only, I shouldn't say the only, but kind of the only environment where some people were trying to do something with the Lindy Hop based on the African American Harlem culture. The others, they were all over the place, kind of. So we were very strict. We were trying to learn everything from scratch again, even though we had danced for a few years, all of us. So it was about coming down to the basics that Al had been trying to pass on.
Okay. And how was the way to teach of Al? Nowadays, most of the teachers explain everything with count, with you do that here and now.
Al, he would just shake his head if he heard that. He didn't teach like that. First of all, from our contemporary point of view, Al was not a teacher. He showed you something, he danced, he gave you the picture of what this dance was all about. He didn't describe it. He was not that kind of person, and he didn't have the know-how. I don't think Al ever learned to count or something. Instructions, yeah, some advice of course, but details, no, not at all. So it was more a natural street dancer's perspective somehow. And I know when he was teaching at Sandra Cameron Studio, he had a protege. His name was Paul Grecki. And Paul was more a traditional dance teacher. So Paul learned from Albert Mintz. And they had classes on 2 different days. Al, who was the master, he collected much less students than Paul did. And Paul was a beginner in the Lindy Hop kind of. But Paul explained things. And you know, that was more suitable for white middle-aged people that came to the classes. Some people took, of course, Al's classes, but it was more difficult for them because he didn't explain. And they probably had problems to pick up what he wanted. So many people took the classes from Paul instead.
Okay.
But still, it was still Al's material or approach. So the Lindy Hop started to spread a little bit in New York again, based on Albert Mintz's way of passing it on. And Sandra Cameron Dance Center at the time, it was probably the only platform for learning the Lindy Hop in a classroom situation.
Yeah. And at the time when Al Mintz decided to teach the Lindy Hop, do you know what happened to him to take this decision?
Yeah, I know that he was not very convinced that he should do it from the beginning, because he expressed first of all that he wasn't a dance teacher. I'm not a teacher, and he also expressed things like, how should I teach this dance? It's not a dance you teach someone. It's something that comes from the street, and you observe it and you try to do something. And he also questioned, I think, whether any students would show up. So I think it took a little bit of convincing from Sandra and her husband Larry Schultz. And Larry was the first man that actually met Al and kind of took him to his wife, Sandra. And then they started to talk. And Larry said, I could be your manager. And Sandra said, you could start to teach here. So they created the platform for Al. And then Al stepped on that platform and started to spread his know-how from his perspective, without counting, without details, without any grammar. He was just showing, saying this is the Lindy. So he accepted, but it took a little bit of convincing from what I understand.
Yeah, and it's you should develop some skills to just observe what you do and reproduce it.
Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning it's quite hard.
And I've seen pictures, and I met some of his students in '84, but I've also seen pictures where I see him teach in the classroom. And without having a too scientific opinion, I would say the following. When I see the line of students that he had, it's very obvious that it's white, middle-aged people, and there is no impression in how they are moving, because from a picture you can see a little bit if a person is a dancer or not. And you see that it's very stiff, everything. So I can understand his problem to come through with his message, because Al was dance all over. And those lines I see behind him, it seems like no dance all over. So I can see the problem when he couldn't explain properly and they had no understanding for swing or dance or move or anything. And I think that's very often at the time it was middle-aged people that just wanted to dance a little bit. They had no full possibility to step into this really. But they were trying something, and Al was trying, but Al was patient. I am sure he didn't become disappointed or something. My memory is that he was very patient.
Nice.
No problems.
And The other name who will come up, it's Frankie Manning. I read in his book that it was Stephen Mitchell who asked him to teach him something.
I mean, no. The traditional version is that Frankie was contacted by Erin Stevens and Stephen Mitchell. They were a dance couple based in Pasadena in California. Some people have objected to that, saying, no, I don't think it was them. Maybe it was some people from the London-based group Jiving Lindy Hoppers. No one knows exactly. But anyway, Erin and Stephen were most likely the first ones taking privates from Frankie.
Yeah.
Frankie was around when we were there in '84, but we didn't know the importance of him. So we saw him as well as many other of the old-timers.
Okay.
But since we had Al's name from jazz dance, he was the main target. Because we understood if Marshall Stearns have used Al as a reference, Al must be important. And when Al told us that he had been dancing in Helsa Poppin', then he was God for us.
Yeah.
So we didn't need anyone else, we felt. Al is here, Al is the man.
Okay.
So we didn't know about Frankie or Norma, even though we met them. We didn't know. They were just faces in the crowd at the time.
Well,
which sounds weird today, but
yeah, it's kind of funny.
Yeah, but we never understood the full context. So we were a little bit narrow-minded at the time.
Yeah. And so, how the meet happened with Frankie Manning and?
For me, I remember quite well. I didn't know about Frankie fully until October 1986. Al passed in April 85. When he passed, we thought that there was no one really to ask any longer. So we were, both on a personal level and a dance professional level, extremely sad when Al passed. He was a friend, but he was also the only source we had for information. So we lived with the old movies, watching, trying to copy, watching, trying to learn for 1.5 years after Al. And then suddenly I traveled to London to meet some of the dancers there, and also to meet a few of the New Yorkers that were in London at the same time. And then Erin and Stephen from Pasadena showed up. And Erin told me about Frankie because they had started to take classes from him. So she said, why don't you contact Frankie Manning, because he was of the same generation as Al. And I said, wow, who is Frankie? And then I was told, yeah, he's one of the dancers in Helsa Poppin'. So when I came home from London, I called Frankie and I said, if I would come to New York, would it be okay that we met up and I could interview you, talk to you and so on. So in February 87 I traveled to New York together with a friend, and then that was the first time I met Frankie, and I knew who he was. I met him in 84 without knowing who he was.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of my relationship with Frankie. And then he came to Sweden in the summer of 87 to work with this group that I told about before, the Rhythm Hotshots. So that was the big 87 in the summer. And we were here in Herrang, but it was not at the dance camp, because the dance camp every year, but they were still more into this jitterbuggish kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we took Frankie here privately.
Okay.
So he was never at the event. It took until 89 for him to come to the event.
Wow. So, yeah, that's why the Rhythm Hotshots were.
Yeah, we were ahead at the time, together with some other dancers in some other places. But gradually we started to become reasonably recognized. We were good at certain things. We were not much of dancers, I would say, but we were good at dancing fast and throwing each other around. And at that time, it was very few people doing those things. So people paid attention, and gradually we became reasonably good dancers too, I think.
And thanks to the Swedish people implicated in development, thanks to Al Means, Frankie Manning and others, something created a boom of Lindy Hop. Can you remember a portion of time where it's starting? Is there a moment you say, "Oh, this is going to be huge.
I think one of the first moments when I really felt that this is getting a little bit bigger than I expected, or there are several moments. The first one was probably when foreigners started to come to Herrang Dance Camp, which was in the early 90s. When they started to come, it was a big question mark from our side. What are they doing here? And why do they come here? We didn't advertise the event, but they had heard about Frankie, you know, a scene Hälsa Poppin'. They had heard something about us maybe organizing it at the time. So they started to come here. And then, of course, that was the first eyebrow coming up. It's so many people. Where did they learn about this? Because this is before the internet and all that thing.
Yeah.
And then in 94, of course, when Frankie turned 80 in New York, then they had a big event. 600, 700, 800 people came, and they were from 8 countries. And that was also, wow, it's a lot of people traveling to New York because of Frankie. That was also an eye-opener. And then gradually it just grew. And then in 98, when it boomed in America, then it was very obvious that, oh, wow, now it's moving. And it was because of this Gap commercial that is quite well known, and a few other things. Yeah. And it really boomed because we had been in America quite many times already teaching or performing. And when we came there in the summer of 98, it was an enormous invasion of young in people. And we had never seen those people in the dance before. It was like an explosion, a complete explosion in America around this. And it was basically from this commercial, but there were a few other reasons too. So those are moments when it really said, whoosh, and something really happened. Yeah. And then, you know, many people started to pick up something. They started to teach over here, over there, over here, over there. And gradually you heard about small scenes there, and you say, wow, they do the Lindy in Singapore. I didn't know that. And Russia, wow, now they are doing it over there too. And you just said, wow, it's so many places. And you don't know exactly why all those things happen. But somehow people heard about it and said, wow, this is a dance I would like to do. And some of them picked up and became local organizers for different events. And that's where we still are. I mean, it's a lot of people. And God knows where they pick up the information from the beginning.
Yeah. It's a amazing way since the starting. And you also a dancer, jazz historian, and also an organizer. Is it difficult to manage all this role?
I don't. I think of it more or less as one piece. I've never felt of it completely as separate pieces. They interact with each other. Now I'm not a performer any longer. Occasionally I perform, but I left it 10 years ago soon because I felt I had enough of it. Somehow I did it for 25 years, and then I didn't want to practice 3-4 times a week and then sit in a bus for 8 hours, perform 20 minutes, go back with the bus. I was just tired of it. And so for me, at some point, let's say early 90s, I felt like a Lindy Hop worker, which meant to me, I want to do as much as I can for this dance, but because it had changed my life in a very positive direction. So I felt, why shouldn't I teach? Why shouldn't I organize something? Maybe I continue with the performance side. I was technically willing to do a little bit of everything that I felt was positive for the dance. So that is very much how I felt. And then it was just the Lindy Hop like this. But it was also tap and a little bit of everything. But Lindy Hop was always in the middle. So it was difficult time-wise to combine those. Because it consumed my life nearly 100% for at least 10-15 years. So I left any ambitions that I might have had around family and regular life. I decided I can't combine those things. I have to choose, and for me at the time I could not choose anything else than the Lindy Hop. So I picked Lindy Hop and I said, okay, I'm gonna marry you now, and here we go. So that's how I felt.
Usually I have some question I always asked about your influences.
About my
influences.
influences.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
About what your favorite dancer, the person who.
There are so many.
Yeah.
I don't have a favorite dancer, but what I always looked at was old film clips. I never looked at really what my contemporaries did. I didn't have the interest fully. To me, it was always, what did it look like back in the days? Because that was the thing I wanted to work with. And it was mainly black dancers. It happened that I looked at white dancers, but it was only occasionally. For me, it was this African-American approach on the dance that attracted me. I knew, of course, that I will never be able to do this. I don't have this background. I don't have the talent. It was impossible, but I also knew that I was willing to work hard. And I knew that if you work hard with something, you will reach a certain point where it might not be too bad. So that's how I felt around it. And then I had a lot of respect for these old-timers that were around, Frankie and all the other people that were at the time. And I really wanted to do something so they felt that we were appreciative of their art. So for me it was very important that we could bring them here and give them a nice time, to step into and give them an audience. It was everything. I was in love with the whole thing. I was obsessed. And that was good.
Yeah.
I like those things, and it stayed for such a long time. Now I'm more balanced, meaning I can do other things in life without saying, I should do the Lindy Hop, because that's over. But there were many years when I felt that everything else was more or less a waste of time. It was about trying to learn how to tap. It was about all these aerials. It was about organizing Herrang. It was about the performances. I have some teaching to do. It was important stuff for me at the time. Now I'm reasonably balanced, yes.
And about the music, the jazz musician, is it some tunes or artists, when you hear them, your feet can't...
I mean, when you spoke to the old-timers, swing dancers, it was always Count Basie. So Basie for me is also, if it comes to dancing and you have a Basie song, I would say I like that. I like that. But I mean, you find, so if there are so many bands that actually were good back in the days, so I wouldn't say I have a favorite band, because it varies over time. My first band that I really said, wow, that was Jimmy Lunceford. Mm-hmm. And it's not, for me now, it's not really swing music the way I would like to Lindy Hop to necessarily. They played in a little bit different way than what I felt with Basie. But in the beginning it was Lunceford I liked, and it was a simple reason. Around the same time as I found Jazz Dance, the book, I was given a record from a friend of mine. He had a little bit to do with the jitterbug, but he said, I think you will like this music. And it was Jimmy Lunceford, 1933, 34. And it was called Harlem Shout. And I played that record, and it was just, wow, this is my music. And at the same time the Lindy Hop. And then after a little while I understood this music and this dance, they are hand in hand.
Tonight there is a speech with Adam Lee, who is also a historian of jazz music, and he will speak about Kansas City music, with especially Basie. Can't wait to hear that.
I wish I had the time. I'm in and out at his lectures because I'm busy sometimes. But Kansas City and Basie and all that stuff, good stuff.
Is it you who invite him to have some lectures?
He invited himself. Mm-hmm. No, he wrote to me asking if we were interested, and then I said, yeah, we are interested, so please come over when you have time. I think it has turned out very successfully what he has done. So I will talk to him and see if we can make a prolongation for next year. Because I like someone that is a musician, a dancer, have studied the history. That triangle is very interesting. I'm not a musician, even though I understand something about music. But he has a deeper know-how and experience and history. And we might be equal on the history part. I might have a little bit more of experience with the dancing part. But his know-how is from this also a little bit of an academic level, which, and I say it in the positive meaning of it, which means a lot of extended know-how about things that I might not fully have the understanding for, even though I'm quite rounded with history. So I find it very interesting.
Yeah.
So I was listening to him first day nearly all the time, and it was a lot of things that he said that I had never been thinking about, very obvious things. And I do a lot of lectures, but still it was like, wow, I've never been thinking of that. That was a good point. So I found it very interesting. So I should be there all the time. That's what I think.
For me, it's amazing. I feel like I'm in heaven when I have your speech and the lectures of Adam. It's wow. It's blowing my mind completely.
Oh, good.
Speaking of your speech, is there some records of your speech?
Which speech do you mean now? Like the Sunday morning thing? Or do you mean the daily meetings or library talks?
The library talks, sorry, yes.
Some of them are recorded, most of them not.
And do you plan to make it online maybe? Or?
At this moment, I don't think there are any plans. And the problem we have in Herrang is that we have an enormous archive. In this very room where we are sitting now, here at this table, we had a man for 25 years. He was the official cameraman at the camp. And then 1.5 years ago, he died from cancer. He has thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of material. And it's partly sorted, but partly maybe not fully. We know where everything is because it is with his widow. But to just start the project of taking all these hours and make something with it, it's a job that will take an enormous amount of time. So at this moment, I only know that we collect material, but when it's going to be public, that's a major question mark.
Yeah.
If you would step in and volunteer for 1 year and sort it out without any payment, we might consider to let you do that. Yeah. But we don't have the resources at this time. We don't have the persons. We don't have the money that it takes to do it. So right now it's just asleep, but we can wake it up. But when, I don't know.
Okay, I will dig that and we will see.
We'll see.
Maybe a mission for me.
Maybe.
Okay, let's ending with that. Thank you very much, Lennart, for your time.
Thank you very much.
And have a good day.
Oh, same to you, and thank you very much. And I'll see you around.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.